Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So no, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter today, uh, Rafael Triana, who will be presenting his paper called Virtue and Violence, the Moral Foundations of Military Character. Dr. Triana is a Marine Reconnaissance Vietnam veteran with a Bronze Star for meritorious leadership in combat, 60 missions. Dr. Triana, thank you ever so much for your service.
Yeah.
He's a psychoanalyst on the University of Virginia Medical Faculty. He's an advocate for the ROTC programs, cultivating civic virtue, military values and culture, and he's a former panelist for the Theatre of War project. After a 35-year tenure at the University of Virginia, Dr. Triana retired from the faculty in 2021. Now, during his time at the university, he did serve in numerous capacities, including assistant professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences, senior staff clinician in counseling and psychological services, CAPS, within the Department of Student Health and Wellness, division head of mental health services, and director of counseling and psychological services. Now, before you start, Dr. Chan, I'd like to ensure that everybody is muted. Dr. China will present for 40 minutes, and then we will open up for 20 minutes of Q&A and discussion. You also, in the top right-hand screen, corner of your screen, have the option of different ways to view the presentation, whether as a gallery or a focus on the speaker. So if anyone is not yet muted, if you could mute yourselves, that would be wonderful. Dr. Triana, I shall hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to see you, Marcy, in our communications. I also want to thank the association for accepting my work, and I'm really excited to present it. I presented at the American Psychoanalytic and the Virginia Psychoanalytic, and in the questions and answer period, I always learn something to help me improve this work. So I look forward to our discussion, and since I have to read, please bear with me. I've got it timed down to 37 minutes and 40 seconds. So we'll see if I can keep to that. So I'm usually rather demure about my military experience, but it's really central to the presentation because out of that experience came all these other parts of the presentation and helping me reflect and understand combat, virtue, etc. So I will begin with that. Yes, I am a former decorated Marine sergeant who served with two consecutive combat tours in Vietnam. I experienced firsthand the moral weight borne by those entrusted with lethal authority. This experience is not invoked to claim status, but to underscore a fundamental truth. Ethical reasoning, divorced from lived responsibility, risks abstraction and stereotypes, while experience without reflection risks moral injury. So I will begin with a quote from Darwin. A tribe including many members who, from possessing a high degree of the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most tribes, and this would be natural selection. So the question becomes, how does a society cultivate a military possessed of sufficient courage, strength, and resolve to confront any enemy, no matter how fierce or unyielding, while at the same time ensuring that it remains a reflection of the very moral values it is charged to defend? This question lies at the foundation of democratic civilization and exposes a central tension at the heart of political and moral life. A free society, grounded in the principles that individuals are endowed with inalienable rights and the liberty to pursue happiness, represents the fullest expression of human aspiration toward flourishing. Yet, a society cannot endure if each individual acts solely in accordance with unbridled desire or unchecked self-interest. The preservation of freedom paradoxically depends upon restraint, obligation, and the willingness at times to subordinate personal interests to the common good. This tension raises a deeper question. What fundamentally motivates moral agents, and in rare cases, moral heroes, to act for the well-being of others when doing so entails profound personal cost, even the sacrifice of their own lives? It is within this moral terrain that the figure of the soldier emerges both as exemplar and enigma. The soldier's life is lived with a profound moral paradox. Military service is animated by ideals of duty, courage, loyalty, sacrifice, virtues that have long been understood from Aristotle to contemporary moral psychology as essential to the cultivation of character and the stability of moral communities. Yet, these same virtues, when enacted in the context of war, compel behaviors that appear to transgress the very moral boundaries they are meant to uphold. To kill in the name of justice, to destroy in order to protect. These are not merely operational contradictions, they are existential tensions that press directly upon conscience and identity. As William James observed in The Moral Equivalent of War in 1910, quote, "The martial virtues, though harsh, are the foundations of civic character," unquote. James recognized that discipline capacities cultivated in military life, endurance, solidarity, self-sacrifice, are not aberrations of moral life, but rather among its most demanding expressions. The paradox, however, is that these virtues are forged and expressed through practices that, outside the context of war, would be considered morally impermissible. Thus, moral mission of the warrior is simultaneously a moral trial. The soldier must integrate two seemingly irreconcilable demands: the necessity of violence in defense of the community and the preservation of one's own humanity within that violence. This is not simply a matter of rule following or adherence to external codes such as just bello and war theory. Rather, it requires the cultivation of phronesis, practical wisdom, through which the individual learns to navigate situations of profound moral ambiguity and tragic constraint. The paradox of virtue and violence therefore reveals something fundamental about morality itself. It demonstrates that virtue is not the absence of conflict, but its disciplined engagement. The soldier becomes the living embodiment of this truth, a figure shaped by a moral ecology that binds individual character to collective purpose, where the highest expression of human virtues are inseparable from the gravest moral risk. In this light, the question is not whether violence can be fully compatible with virtue. Such a resolution is neither philosophical nor psychologically plausible, but whether human beings can be formed in such a way that even within violence, they remain orientated toward the good. The enduring challenge of any civilization, therefore, is not merely defending itself, but to do so without losing the moral commitments that make it worth defending. Now there's a problem, which I call the warrior virtue translation problem. The warrior translation problem can be clarified through the work of Samuel P. Huntington's concept of, quote, the ideological constant, unquote. In The Soldier and State, Huntington argues that there persists a structural tension that exists between liberal democratic society and the military profession because each is organized around fundamentally different norms. Liberal society emphasizes individual liberty, pluralism, skepticism about authority, and personal autonomy, whereas the military depends on discipline, hierarchy, obedience, collective identity, and the organized use of force in defense of the state. This tension, Huntington contends, is not historically contingent, but an enduring feature of democratic civic-military relations, requiring continual negotiation rather than resolution. This divide echoes long-standing concerns among the American founding fathers, who were very wary of the standing armies due to their association in Europe with monarchical powers and threats to republican governments. Over time, this caution has contributed to a broader cultural ambivalence within segments of American intellectual and civic life about the moral status of military institutions. In certain periods, particularly during strong anti-war movements, moral opposition to war has extended beyond policy critique to encompass negative judgments about soldiers themselves. Universities and intellectual elites have often served as the focal point for this critique, further widening the cultural distance between civilian and military communities. For example, research interest in the MAOA gene increased after studies linked certain variants to impulsive aggression, but media coverage following a 2004 study sensationalized the low activity variant as the quote warrior gene unquote, implying a simplistic biological basis for aggression despite the far more complex gene environment nature of the research. The popularization of the term warrior gene reflects what Huntington described as the enduring ideological constant within democratic society, the persistent cultural tension between liberal civilian values and the military profession. By linking warrior-like behavior to aggression, impulsivity, and antisocial tendencies, the label subtly reinforces longstanding suspicion toward the moral legitimacy of martial virtues themselves, rather than distinguishing between discipline and military character from criminal or uncontrollable violence. The phrase collapses the two into a singular symbolic category, implying that traits associated with soldiers are biologically proximate to pathology. This framing mirrors broader cultural assumptions increasingly visible within the revisionist just war theory, where the moral status of soldiers is often evaluated through highly individualized and abstract moral frameworks that weaken the traditional distinctions between legitimate military service and wrongful violence. With such cultural narratives, the warrior ceases to be as morally formed citizen operating with institutional codes of restraint, duty, and sacrifice, and instead becomes imagined as psychologically dangerous figures whose virtues are interpreted primarily through therapeutic, pathological, or criminological lenses. The warrior gene metaphor therefore functions not merely as scientific shorthand, but as a cultural symbol that reproduces civilian ambivalence toward military institutions and reinforces the negative stereotypes of soldiers embedded within contemporary intellectual media culture. Empirical research, 9 studies in moral psychology, reinforces this account by demonstrating that there exists a fundamental asymmetry in moral judgment. Evaluations of individual soldiers are strongly shaped by prior beliefs about the justice of the war they fight. As a result, even soldiers who adhere to rules of engagement are often judged as morally compromised if the war itself is perceived as unjust. Taken together, these findings suggest that civilian moral evaluations are not neutral assessments of conduct in combat, but are filtered through prior ideological commitments and intuitive biases. This dynamic sustains the translation problem, obscuring moral structure of disciplined military virtue, and reinforces the gap between civilian perception and the lived ethical framework of the professional soldiers. So, my solution to the translation problem is this: the tragic vision of human nature. Selfish behavior is controlled and constrained not just by individual conscience and direct concerns about harm and fairness, but by interlocking combination of physical, psychological, cultural, and institutional mechanisms. What is needed then is a comprehensive moral psychology that studies the full array of psychological mechanisms that are active in the lives of people in diverse cultures that have found multiple ways to suppress selfishness. With the integration of outside the head elements studied by anthropologists and sociologists and inside the head brain-based explanations of these mechanisms with an evolutionary account of how these mechanisms evolved. So we're going to go to outside the head in terms of an anthropological view. And I will use Thomas Sowell's 1987, A Conflict of Vision, offers a powerful framework for understanding enduring disagreements about politics, morality, and war by distinguishing between two underlying orientations, the constrained vision, or the tragic vision, and the unconstrained vision, the utopian vision. Thomas Sowell defends vision not as a fully reasoned theory, but as a deep, often implicit set of underlying assumptions about human nature and social reality that precede and shape reasoning itself. As he put it in A Conflict of Visions, quote, visions are the foundations on which theories are built, unquote. More fully, visions are pre-analytic, what we sense or feel before we have constructed any systematic reasoning, and they determine what we consider possible, necessary, or desirable. In this sense, the tragic and utopian visions are not merely policy preferences, but competing moral epistemological starting points. The tragic vision assumes enduring human limits and trade-offs, while the utopian vision assumes the possibility of overcoming them. The disagreement about war flows directly from these prior visions, where the conflict is an ineradicable condition to be managed or a problem ultimately to be solved. The constrained vision begins with a sober assessment of human nature. It assumes that human beings are inherently limited, morally imperfect, self-interested, and only partially rational. Because these constraints, social order depends less on ideal intentions and more on evolved institutions, traditions, and practices that channel behavior towards stability and cooperation. In this view, war is a tragic but sometimes unavoidable feature of human existence. The use of force is not seen as a moral failure per se, but as a necessary instrument for preserving order and protecting against aggression. Accordingly, the constrained vision emphasizes discipline, hierarchy, and the cultivation of virtues such as courage, loyalty, and restraint that enable individuals, particularly soldiers, to act ethically under conditions of conflict. War, while regrettable, is governed by norms, rules of engagement, just war principles that reflect an attempt to impose moral limits within an imperfect world. In Sowell's usage, trade-off means that achieving one valued good necessarily requires giving up, limiting, or risking another, because human capacities, knowledge, and resources are finite. There are no perfect solutions, only choices among competing goods and costs. For example, in war, military adopts strict rules of engagement to minimize civilian casualties, a moral good. But doing so can increase risk of its own soldiers and potentially reduce operational effectiveness. Alternatively, loosening those constraints may improve battlefield success and troop safety, but at the cost of greater harm to non-combatants and moral legitimacy. A trade-off is a recognition that both values cannot be maximized simultaneously. Choosing one entails accepting costs in the other. By contrast, the constrained vision rests on a more optimistic view of human nature and human potential. It assumes that through reason, education, and moral progress, individual societies can overcome historical limitations and approach a more just and humane form of social organization. From this perspective, war is not an inevitable condition, but a preventable failure, often the result of flawed institutions, unjust power structures, or insufficient moral development. The unconstrained vision tends to place greater faith in abstract moral reasoning, universal principles such as human rights, and the possibility of designing systems that reduce or eliminate the need for violence. As a result, it is often more critical of traditional military institutions and more inclined to question the moral legitimacy of war, particularly when it appears inconsistent with higher ethical ideals. Sowell's key insight is that these visions are not merely policy preferences, but reflect deep often implicit assumptions about human nature, knowledge, and moral possibility. In the context of war, they generate fundamentally different interpretations. One sees war as a tragic necessity requiring discipline, moral formation, while the other views it as a redeemable injustice calling for moral and institutional reform. So now we're going to go inside the head. And that requires a paradigm shift, as Hans Kuhn talked about in 1960. The structure of scientific revolution. Paradigm shifts arise when the dominant paradigm under which normal science operates is rendered incompatible with new phenomena, facilitating the adoption of new theories or paradigms. The translation paradigm solution that I've chosen is consilience. E.O. Wilson's The Unity of Knowledge, the linking together of principles from different scientific disciplines to form an explanatory framework for understanding virtue in violence. Now, Freud's concept of the war neurosis aligns easily with Thomas Sowell's constrained tragic vision in its underlying assumptions about human nature and the limits of reason. For Freud, war neurosis reveals that human mind is not governed primarily by rational control or moral intention, but by deeper instinctual forces, aggression, fear, and unconscious conflict that can overwhelm the ego under extreme conditions. The repetition of trauma, the breakdown of stimulus power, and the reemergence of primitive drives all point to inherent psychological limitations. The psyche can never fully master or prevent suffering through reason alone. This maps directly to Sowell's constrained vision, which shows that human beings are morally and cognitively limited, prone to conflict, and incapable of perfectibility. In this view, war is not simply the result of bad ideas or flawed institutions, as in the unconstrained vision, but arises from enduring aspects of human nature, competition, aggression, and the fragility of the social order. Thus, Freud's war neurosis can be read as clinical evidence of the tragic vision. Under the stress of war, the veneer of civilization thins, revealing the persistent, unruly substrate of human nature and confirming that moral life is shaped not by utopian solutions, but by management of enduring tensions and trade-off. Quote, psychoanalysis included that the primitive, savage, and evil impulses of mankind have not vanished in any individual, but continue their existence, although in a repressed state of the unconscious, as we call it in our language, and that they wait for opportunities to display their activity. So we're going to move now a little bit more into modernity. Over the past several decades, the scientific study of human nature has undergone a profound transformation. The rise of evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology, and behavioral genetics has produced a body of evidence that challenges the long-standing utopian assumptions embedded in much of modern intellectual life. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing orthodox in humanities and social science rests around three interlocking propositions that Steven Pinker terms the blank state, the noble savage, and the ghost in the machine. The blank slate thesis denies any innate psychological evolutionary structure. The noble savage myth idealizes human goodness prior to social influence, and the ghost in the machine claims that reason or will can transcend biological constraint. These doctrines held that human beings are infinitely malleable, innately benevolent, and capable of transcending biological constraints to pure reason or will. The new sciences have decisively overturned these assumptions. They have revealed instead a species shaped by evolutionary pressures, marked by cognitive limitations, motivated partially by altruism, and organized around tribal loyalties and competing interests. In doing so, they provide strong empirical support for Sowell's tragic vision, which emphasizes the permanence of human limitations, the inevitability of trade-offs, and the need for institutional structures that channel rather than deny constraints on human nature. The conversion also reinforces Huntington's account of the ideological constant, the enduring tension between society's aspirations, moral ideals, and the sobering realities imposed by human psychology and political order. As Steven Pinker argues, the central question is not simply why violence occurs, Human self-interest, aggression, and competition make violence an enduring aspect of human nature. But how is violence constrained? Human nature is both the problem and the solution. The same species capable of cruelty also possesses capacities for empathy, self-regulation, moral reasoning, and cooperation, what Pinker calls our better angels, emerge to the cultivation and habituations of virtues that strengthen self-control. Discipline, aggression, and bind individuals into moral and social norms. In this view, civilization depends less on eliminating violent impulses than on developing psychological, cultural, and institutional capacities that regulate them. The research of Roy Baumeister and contemporary neuroimaging converge on the view that self-control is foundational, psychological capacity underlying moral behavior and the restraint of aggression. Baumeister's experiments on self-regulations demonstrate that the ability to inhibit impulses, delay gratification, and persist under stress functions much like a trainable strength. Individuals with stronger self-control show greater emotional regulation, less aggression, and more prosocial behavior. Neuroimaging studies further support this model by identifying the prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral and ventral medial regions, as central to executive control, impulse inhibition, and moral decision-making. These findings suggest that civilization and virtue depend not on the absence of violent impulses, but on the cultivation of neural and psychological capacity that constrain them through habituated self-regulation. Jonathan Haidt's work in The Righteous Mind offers a complementary and contemporary confirmation of this trajectory. Quote, we believe that virtue theories are the most psychologically sound approaches to morality in dealing with our innate, non-moral, asocial, egotistical tendencies. We believe that virtue theories are the most psychologically sound approach to morality. Such theories fit more neatly into what we know about moral development, judgment, and behavior than do theories that focus on moral reasoning or the acceptance of high-level moral principles such as justice. Haidt's research demonstrates that moral judgments arise not from detached deliberation, but from rapid intuitive processes shaped by evolutionary history. His account of multiple moral foundations, group-based cohesion, and the primacy of intuition over reason aligns closely with Sowell's tragic visions. Human beings, in Haidt's rendering, are not autonomous rational agents, but socially embedded, emotionally driven creatures whose moral communities are often in tension with one another. This framework not only corroborates the empirical findings from evolutionary and psychological and cognitive science, but also affirms the institutional humility that Sowell argues is necessary for any stable social order. Haidt's synthesis thus stands as independent endorsement of Sowell's depiction of human nature and further situates the tragic vision within a broader interdisciplinary understanding of moral psychology. Contemporary findings in moral psychology and neuroscience provide compelling higher-order evidence that challenge the epistemic assumptions underlying moral theories grounded primarily in abstract reasoning. Whereas first-order evidence concerns reasons that directly support claims, higher order evidence evaluates the reliability and coherence of the cognitive processes that generate those claims. As Jonathan Haidt and others have advanced in neuroscience, reveal that the core cognitive functions, learning, attention, memory, decision-making, and social judgment, are deeply shaped and guided by emotional processes rather than operating as independent rational systems. Converging research from Anton Damasio, Jonathan Haidt, Joshua Green, Daniel Kahneman, and Matt Liebman and others further demonstrates that moral reasoning is never fully detached or fully objective. That's why we have experimental design in labs, but is instead embedded in intuitive, affective, and socially conditioned processes that precede conscious deliberation. Freud. Psychoanalysis further taught us that our intellect is a feeble and dependent thing, a plaything and tool of our impulses and emotions, that all of us are forced to behave cleverly or stupidly according to our attitudes and inner resistances ordained. David Hume, reason is and ought only to be the slave of passion and can never pretend any other office other than to serve and obey them. Robert Wright, an evolutionary psychologist, writes as, quote, "The proposition here is that the human brain is, in large part, a machine for winning arguments, a machine for convincing others that its owner is in the right, thus a machine for convincing its owner of the same thing. The brain is like a good lawyer. Given any set of interests to defend, it sets about convincing the world of their moral and logical worth, regardless of whether they have in fact either. Like a lawyer, the human brain wants victory, not truth, and like a lawyer is sometimes more admirable for skill than for virtue." And I apologize if there's any lawyers in the audience. When examined as a whole, this body of work does more than describe how moral judgment occurs. It calls into question the reliability of the reasoning process, emphasizes in deontological and utilitarian frameworks. In doing so, it strengthens the case for virtue ethic approaches which are more consistent with empirically grounded understanding of moral cognition as socially embedded, emotionally structured, and developed through habituated practices rather than abstract principles alone. From this perspective, theories that prioritize abstract reason grounded in deontological utilitarian logic rest on epistemic assumptions that are empirically unstable. If moral cognition is fundamentally shaped by intuition, emotion, and social embeddedness, then the claim that moral judgments can be derived through dispassionate context of independent reasoning is undermined at the level of cognition processes itself. By contrast, virtue ethics, within its emphasis on habituation, character formation, and socially embedded practical wisdom, aligns more closely with the empirical structure of moral cognition. Thus, contemporary research provides not only descriptive insight into how moral judgments occur, but also higher order evidence that challenges the epistemic foundations of purely rational moral theories while strengthening the plausibility of virtue-based accounts. Roy Baumeister's extensive research bridges classical virtue ethics and contemporary psychology by grounding virtue in self-regulation, the capacity to control impulses, emotions, and behavior in the service of longer-term moral commitments. Rather than treating virtue as an abstract ideals, he shows that it operates at a trainable psychological capacity closely paralleling Aristotle's notion of habituation. His, quote, "strength model," unquote, of willpower further demonstrates that self-control is both limited and developable in enabling individuals to sustain discipline, integrity, prosocial behavior under compelling pressures. Similarly, James Coan's social-based theory, that's also based on MRI studies, shows that human regulation of threat and effort is fundamentally relational, with social cohesion reducing cognitive and physiological burdens. This framework provides a compelling account of military training as a system of moral formation through repeated stress exposure, structured routines, hierarchical accountability. Service members cultivate heightened regulatory capacities that allow them to inhibit destructive impulses and maintain ethical conduct in extreme conditions. Baumeister's broader view of violence as meaning-driven, not merely impulsive, also clarifies how military institutions channel aggression into norm-governed actions shaped by the law of armed conflict and unit cohesion. Rules of engagement should not be understood merely as legalistic restrictions, but as institutionalized expressions of virtue ethics within modern warfare. They translate the ancient principles of how wars conducted just in bello into actionable forms, shaping perception, guiding judgment, and reinforcing the moral identity of the soldier. In doing so, they embody the central paradox of the warrior profession. The capacity for disciplined violence must always be accompanied by an equally disciplined commitment to restraint. At the same time, this model highlights vulnerabilities. When these regulatory and meaning systems are disrupted, particularly during transition to civilian life, the results may be diminished self-control, loss of purpose, and increased risk of moral injury and identity fragmentation. Integrated with moral foundations theory, the perspective becomes more comprehensive. Haidt explains how moral intuitions are socially formed within moral communities, while Baumeister explains how those institutions are enacted through disciplined self-regulation under stress. Together, they suggest that virtue depends both on embeddedness in a shared moral ecology and the cultivated capacity to translate moral commitments into action when most tested. The deepest bridge between Roy Baumeister and Thomas Sowell is this. Both reject that the idea that evil arises from ignorance or from correctable defects in social arrangements. For each, the central problem is not what human beings don't know, but what they cannot reliably do, namely restrain their impulses, regulate their passions, and act under pressure. Baumeister's claim that evil results from failures of self-regulation is a psychological articulation of Sowell's strategic vision. Sowell argues that human nature is permanently constrained by limited rationality, limited virtue, and limited self-control. Baumeister shows experimentally and clinically how those limits manifest in real behavior. When self-regulation collapses through fatigue, fear, humiliation, group pressure, or moral disorientation, people commit acts that they would otherwise condemn. This is precisely the terrain of the tragic vision. The recognition that human beings are not naturally good, not reliable, rational, and not easily governed by moral ideals without strong external and internal constraints. In this light, Baumeister becomes the psychological mechanism behind Sowell's anthropology. Sowell describes the structural limits of human nature. Baumeister describes the functional limits. Sowell explains why society must build systems of constraint. Baumeister explains why individuals fail those systems when those systems erode. Excuse me. Both converge on the same conclusion. Evil is not an aberration, but a predictable consequence of human frailty and under strain. The synthesis reframes moral failure, especially in war, not as a mystery, but as a foreseeable breakdown of the very capacities that the tragic region warns are always fragile. Violations of just in bello, how we handle combat, thus becomes the lived expression of the tragic vision. Moments when the thin membrane of self-regulation tears and the constraints that normally hold violence in check fail to do so. Baumeister gives empirical evidence to Sowell's philosophical warning. Without disciplined character, institutional restraint, and realistic expectations of human weakness, moral norms alone cannot prevent both converge that evil is not an aberration, predictable consequence. Well, I lost my place. Oh, without disciplined character, institution, restraint, as with Baumeister's work, the work of Philip Zimbardo provides a compelling empirical and theoretical bridge between virtue ethics and the moral foundations of military character, directly supporting the premise of virtue and violence framework. Best known for the Stanford Prison Experiment, Zimbardo demonstrates how situation forces can rapidly shape behavior, often toward cruelty or moral disengagement. However, in his later work, particularly The Elusive Effect and the Heroic Imagination Project, he advances a complementary thesis that individuals can be systematically prepared to resist destructive situational pressures through the cultivation of prosocial dispositions, moral awareness, and disciplined self-regulation. This shift from a pathology-focused model how good people do bad things, to a virtue-oriented model, how ordinary people become moral agents under pressure, aligns closely with Aristotle's conception of virtue as habituated excellence. In military contexts, where extreme conditions heighten situational pressures, Zimbardo's work underscores the necessity of intentional institutional design, training, norms, leadership modeling, and unit cohesion to cultivate virtues such as restraint, loyalty, courage, and moral judgment, chronesis. These cultivated capacities not only regulate conduct in combat, but also provide critical mechanisms for the translation of military morality into civilian life, as they are internalized as stable character traits rather than remaining context-bound behavioral responses. In this way, Zimbardo's empirical insight supports the claim that virtue formation is not incidental, but essential to sustaining moral agency within and beyond the moral complex environment of war. Almost finished, guys. Considered
Okay.
collectively, the evidence supports the epistemological argument central to virtue and violence in the foundations of military character by distinguishing between first-order and higher-order evidence. First-order evidence consists of reasons that directly support moral claims, whereas higher-order evidence evaluates the reliability, coherence, and trustworthiness of the processes by which the claims are formed. From this standpoint, virtue ethics approaches to possess stronger higher-order evidence support because they are grounded in a consilient framework in the sense of articulated E.O. Wilson that integrates converging insights across disciplines. Traditional principles governing conduct in war, including restraint, discrimination, and disciplined obedience, align with empirically supported accounts of moral condition, the intuitive and socially embedded nature of moral development and judgment described by Haidt, the evolutionary co-regulated foundations of human cognition emphasized in contemporary social neuroscience. Last paragraph. Within the military
Okay.
context, these converging lines, evidence illuminates how moral character is not derived from abstract reasoning alone, but is cultivated through habituation with cohesive social systems and may be understood as the warrior moral ecosystem. Here, virtues such as loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice are enacted under conditions of shared risk, reinforcing both individual regulation and collective moral identity. The empirical grounding accounts stand in contrast to more purely rationalistic approaches, suggesting the moral legitimacy of discipline, conduct is not normatively defensible, but supported at the level of higher order evidence. In this way, almost done, virtue and violence is not a paradox to be resolved, but a moral reality to be understood. The disciplined cultivation of character within structured moral communities enables the ethical use of force in ways that are both psychologically and coherent and socially necessary. So, Thomas Sowell, The Tragic Anthropological Limitations. Freud contributes to the psychological accounts of instinct and aggression. Pinker reframes violence not as an anomaly requiring explanation, but as persistent human possibility requiring constraint. Haidt demonstrates the moral judgments emerge primarily through intuitions. And Baumeister, the psychological occurrence to self-regulation, Cohen's and social scaffolding of relationships, and Zimbardo demonstrates about loyalty and virtue. So I'll stop there.
All right. So, Dr. Triana, thank you ever so much.